Peace BAIO family, I'm your host Shabari Lim, and this is another edition of the BAIO News. And in this video, we'll be talking about the new document that discussed Liberia's 1821 Purchase Agreement. Before I begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Make sure you comment down below, tell us what you think about these videos, and of course, make sure to sign up to the website at afrikstan.org/register. So, if you haven't heard, just recently, the Washington Post, as well as Global News Network Liberia, were talking about the discovery of Liberia's 1821 Purchase Agreement. And from the Global News Network Liberia, the title reads, 200 years later, a long-lost document sheds light on the purchase of Liberia, and it was written by Cholo Brooks. Now, this is going to go in depth about how Liberia was purchased, and it really debunks a lot of the myths there. There will be some myths that will be debunked in this article, and I'm going to talk about my 3 points that this whole document sheds. And it's one, the Liberian document will debunk that African Americans brought the Western mindset to Liberia, because that's been used countless times as a reason why we shouldn't go back to Africa, because we'll bring the quote-unquote Western mindset. The Liberia document proves the vitality of the African slave trade. And then, of course, this is going to debunk the myth that African Americans and Liberians didn't work together. So I'm about to read the article, and I'm going to be giving my commentary as I'm reading it. It was built as a land of promise, a place where free Black Americans could obtain more political rights and a better quality of life. Liberia did not receive its name until 1824, but the territory that became its capital city was purchased on December 15, 1821. Almost exactly 200 years later, a Liberian historian has discovered the original purchase agreement, a document missing since 1835 that sheds light on the acquisition of the only U.S. colony in Africa. That is a mistake. That is a misnomer. It was not a former colony of the United States. It was owned by a private organization known as the American Colonization Society. So that statement of it being a U.S. colony in Africa is not true. Now, you could say it's a vassal state. You could say it was sort of like it, but it wasn't a former colony recognized by the United States. Patrick Burrowes, who was born in Liberia and has taught at Penn State, Harrisburg, and Marshall University, uncovered the handwritten document in August. It details the sale of a tract of West African land that later became Monrovia, the Liberian capital. The selling price was about $300 worth of weapons, rum, and other merchandise. So it goes on to say, for historians, finding the purchase agreement has been most significant discovery of his career. He said, and for the historical understanding of Liberia's origin, this document helps debunk several prevailing myths about the acquisition of territory that became its capital. So this is very important, as Hewart Brewer, a Morgan State University historian who studied slavery in the African American diaspora, because the details of it have been shrouded in controversy, is what he later talks about. And this sort of clears things up. So it talks about that this is going to give historians and Liberians an opportunity to rethink the country's history, and that's what we here at the BAIO have been trying to do. We have been trying to change the narrative about Liberia, because the way that Liberia has been talked about, the image of Liberia has been really a false one, it's an inaccurate one, and it's a harmful one. And we've been doing to correct those myths about the history of Liberia. And this document just confirms what we've been talking about, excuse me, for the last year of African Americans and indigenous Liberians. And no land surveys of the territory were conducted, so its precise dimensions were unspecified. Various sources will later provide hugely inflated numbers, but Burrowes deduced from an 1824 map that the initial purchase involved only about 140 acres. He added that a similar piece of land in much of the United States would have sold for considerably less in that era. The buyers were two white men, U.S. Naval Lieutenant Robert Stockton and Eli Ayres, an agent of the American Colonization Society, an organization founded in 1816 that sought to encourage and facilitate free African Americans to return to their ancestral land. And the American Colonization Society was inspired by a man by the name of Paul Cuffe. We've talked about him numerous times. The fact that Paul Cuffe really pioneered the Back to Africa movement by sending 38 African Americans to Sierra Leone, and of course reaching out to Robert Finley, the founder of the American Colonization Society. And it says that the writing matched Ayres' handwriting on other papers, and that Stockton's signature on the document matched his signature on other letters from that period. And it's going to talk about Stockton's contradiction. So On one hand, when he reached naval rank and became a U.S. Senator for New Jersey, he really embodied antebellum America's contradictory stance on slavery. The U.S. Navy, he was one of the first officers on the U.S. Navy's anti-slavery patrol. Stockton was so dogged in pursuing foreign slave ships that he unsettled diplomatic relations with France, which filed a protest against one of his ship seizures. And yet, for all his opposition to further importation of enslaved people, he had no objection to the South's slave system of human bondage. In fact, he enslaved African laborers on his own Georgia sugar plantation, And we've seen this with Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Marshall, Bourgeois Washington. We've seen this with, to a certain degree, Abraham Lincoln, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster. This idea that we are opposed to importing slaves and we are opposed to slavery, but we don't want black people here. Or in the case of importation with slaves, we don't want importation of slaves, but we're comfortable with the domestic slave trade and we encourage it and we even expand it. Because during this time, slavery was expanding to the Mississippi Valley, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. It was spreading to Arkansas. Missouri became a slave state. So it shows the hypocrisy of a lot of these founders in that on one hand, they oppose the importation of slaves, yet perfectly comfortable with the domestic slave trade, or they oppose slavery, but they said that black people would never get equality, that black and white people should separate, and that black people should go back to Africa, aka what some people call the colonization movement, although it's really the Back to Africa movement. The land purchase highlights the fact that opposition to slavery was not exclusive to clusters of outraged Americans. John Mill, a biracial West African native. So this right here shows that there were biracials in Africa, that they weren't just a whole bunch of pure Africans. They were actually biracial and mixed race people on the continent. And he says serving local rulers as a secretary. So that means if he's mixed race and he's serving as a local ruler, serving local rule as a secretary, that means he's had experience working with Europeans. He's a product of Europeans, so there has to be Europeans there. So this completely debunks the myth that we brought the Western mindset. The Western mindset was already there. They were already interacting with Europeans. This was not the first time that they interacted with Europeans. And he said after the purchase negotiations had recently given up his lucrative slave trade business because of troubled conscience, the rulers were willing to listen to pro-slavery arguments. Let me emphasize that again. Pro-slavery arguments. But they ultimately cast their lot with the opposing side by selling land to the ACS over objections of local slave traders who saw the move as a threat to their business. One can say then, Burrowes said, that Liberia was founded as an abolitionist nation. And we've talked about this over and over again. When we talk about the tensions between African Americans and the native population, yes, there were some things that the African Americans did wrong, but one of the things that gets constantly glossed over is the slave trade. The fact that they were selling slaves, they were raiding African American villages. As a matter of fact, there was a massacre, the Port Croissant Massacre in Buchanan in 1835, where African Americans were killed because one of the local rulers there, one of the local kings, was losing money because the African Americans there wanted to get rid of the slave trade. And we see right here just how important the slave trade was. So Liberia was revolutionary in that it was an abolitionist nation. And then, of course, it's going to explain how he was able to find it. So Burrowes searched the archive of the first two lawyers without success, but when he turned to the files of Elias B. Caldwell, a Supreme Court clerk and part-time ACS secretary, he discovered the agreement in the microfilm archive of the Chicago History Museum's Bourgeois Washington collection. And of course, Bourgeois Washington was part of the American Colonization Society. He was the nephew of George Washington, by the way. And now we go into this article's myth, but we already talked about some of the myths that we have addressed that this article just confirms and debunks. Myth number 1. Local West African rulers rejected the contract because their societies prohibited the buying and selling of land. Aside from the fact that the purchase agreement itself shows formal approval of the land sale, Burrowes pointed out that the nascent Liberian colony expanded through 4 additional land purchases between 1825 and 1828. So it wasn't just we founded Monrovia or Providence Island and then just started land grabbing. There were agreements that this land was going to be purchased. And we've had plenty of our members and even people in our chat that have constantly emphasized. One in particular has constantly said, no, African Americans bought the land. And this is what this just confirms. Moreover, 3 of the 4 subsequent transactions involved land sold by 6 local signatories to the original 1821 contract, known as by the names Peter, George, Zoda, Long Peter, Governor, and Jimmy. So this was not just one ruler. It was literally done by 6 of them. This means there was consent. The indigenous people were cool with African Americans landing in Liberia. Period. Point blank. End of discussion. Myth number 2. Local rulers were not able to comprehend the content of the contract because they did not understand English. This myth seems to ignore the historical reality that the region where the land purchase took place had already seen centuries of contact with European traders, their goods, and their contractual documents. Some local African elites had borne Western names for hundreds of years, Burrowes said. And I highlighted that. So you can't say we brought the Western mindset because they were having Western names before African Americans even got there. So before we even step foot, they speak in English, they speak in French, they speak in Dutch, they're able to do contractual documents. I've said this over and over again. People treat indigenous Liberians, 1, as a monolithic group, 2, as primitive and backwards, and 3 as in they don't know no better. When in reality, these were kingdoms. They had their own interests, their own societies, and they were contacted with the world. They just weren't isolated. They were engaging with the world. An example would be Grand Cape Mount, near the Sierra Leonean border. Liberian Past and Present talks about this. At the negotiations, one of the purchasers' agreement signatories spoke to heirs in English. So they knew what they were signing. It wasn't like they didn't know. He was speaking to him in English. So that means they understood what was going on. Additionally, Mills, the West African secretary, was fluent in English, having received almost a decade of schooling in Liverpool, England. The discovery of his signatory on the agreement confirms that he was part of the negotiations. Let me get this straight. This man was in Liverpool, England, and he's an indigenous Liberian. Before African Americans even got there, before we even stepped foot on there, you have an indigenous Liberian in Liverpool, England. One that indicates that they were wealthy. These were not no poor, primitive, indigenous Liberians that has been portrayed. That means a highly wealthy, highly respected indigenous man that was there, that was present. Debunks the myth that they didn't have no civilized societies. These were kingdoms. These were confederations like the Congo Confederation. These were societies. Myth number 3. The land was purchased at gunpoint. This myth has some appearance of credibility. Stockton, a veteran of several duels, was no stranger to gunplay, and he did brandish 2 pistols during the negotiations. And I highlighted this. However, popular accounts sensationalized his actions and stripped them of his context, said Burrowes, who noted that Stockton pulled his gun in response to 2 pro-slavery outsiders who had come seeking to sabotage the negotiation. 2 pro-slavery, so they were sabotaging us. But we get the blame for it. We're colonizers. We're the problem. Completely forgetting the indigenous people selling slaves. Completely forgetting that they were already in contact with Europeans. Completely forgetting the fact that they were waging war against each other. completely excluding the fact that they were sabotaged. Now, like I said, that doesn't mean that African Americans didn't inflict stuff or exclude indigenous people. That's not the point of this argument or what I'm trying to say is. Our point and what the BAIO has constantly stated, look at it objectively and look at everything. Don't talk about us being the problem and then completely negate this going on. The wars that were going on. Even more, this is the icing on the cake for this. The date on the purchase agreement reveals that it was signed a full day after Stockton drew his pistols. And he says, so even if he had been sufficiently rash to threaten local rulers, they would have had more than enough time to mobilize their own gun-toting forces. So they had guns. They had an army. Like I've said before, there's no way we could have survived in Liberia without the consent and acceptance of the majority of Liberians, indigenous people. There's no way. If they really wanted to, they could have wiped us out. But they didn't because they cared. Furthermore, it talks about Burrowes said that growing up in Liberia, he and his classmates learned very little accurate information about the original 1821 purchase. Mostly what I remember hearing and believing were myths about Stockton and the agreement. And he says, though the African American settlers in Liberia, also known as Americo-Liberians, occupied a relatively small portion of land, they had a tense and complicated relations with the native population. There were conflicts as well as collaboration, intermarriage, and cultural mixtures, Burrowes said. By the end of the 19th century, he said, about 15,000 African Americans had migrated to Liberia, along with 6,000 African rescued from illegal slave ships and 300 Afro-Caribbeans. Some say it's 3,000. Most of those Afro-Caribbeans were Bajans from the Barbados. Letters written by African Americans who came to Liberia often detail hardships such as losing relatives to malaria and other tropical diseases. A few hundred people even gave up on their new lives and returned to the United States, but the vast majority chose to stay despite the high mortality rates. Even with often lethal difficulties, and newcomers had more civil liberties and better chance at self-determination than they had in their previous land. And the letters, Burrowes pointed out, also expressed joy at truly being free. And that is the end of the article. That is the end of the article. But I really just want to emphasize that fact because we have seen over and over and over and over again about how Liberia, how we were just these oppressors, when in reality, paints a completely different picture. Not even remotely true what happened. But if you listen to mainstream news, videos on YouTube, you think we are the oppressors. You would think we are the oppressors. And actually, I want to go to see another document by C. Patrick Burrowes because he is a great historian. He does good work. And he wrote a book. He wrote two books. He wrote Between the Cola Forest and the Salty Sea. And that one basically talks about Liberia before the 1800s. And then he wrote Liberia's Quest for Freedom. The half-truths have not been told. That's never been told. And one of the about page that I really want to emphasize, it says, I want to emphasize the ending. He says, by pretending they did not happen, we destroy our ability to tell the right from wrong, victims from villains. Echoes of the slavery era can be heard in derogatory names. We call each other Ligio, Bele, and ex-slaves. Liberians living today are all called upon to build upon peace by doing away with relations of great inequality. They have no better example than the first generation of Liberia, both Apaches and indigenous, who worked together to do just that. And that is Liberia and the Quest for Freedom. That's the halves that have never been told. And that's by C. Patrick Burrowes. He was the one who uncovered the document. He does a great job talking about Liberian history. And Between the Cola Forest and the Salty Sea, this one emphasized about Liberian society before the 1800s. And it basically talks about before Liberia was created. He said the different languages and ethnic groups of Liberia shared a common root. The barkless KK dog found in Liberian villages were a favorite pet of ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Cola, once used as an ingredient in soft drinks, was discovered by the ancestors of Liberia. Early European explorers learned from early Liberian seafarers how to navigate some dangerous currents in winds of the Atlantic Ocean. Rice growers from West Africa's grain coast helped teach Americans how to grow rice. So this is just showing you that these indigenous societies were not ignorant. They were advanced. They had their own customs, traditions. They were their own civilizations, and it's time to respect that. Give them that give them that symbol, give them that status that they were advanced societies. Stop treating the indigenous people like they were primitive. They were helpless. They couldn't fight. They couldn't do no better. They were waging wars against us. We talked about this war, the Maryland Grebo War, the Liberia Grebo War. We talked about the Day Settler War. We've talked about the Bassa Wars. We've talked about there have been numerous wars when their interests were threatened. The Port Crescent Massacre that I just mentioned. We need to be honest about this. Stop telling us when we bought this Western mindset when it was there for centuries. Stop telling us we didn't have the right to defend ourselves when they were selling slaves and even listening to pro-slavery arguments. Stop saying that there's always this conflict between African Americans and the indigenous people when we were marrying each other, when Grebos were in House of Representatives under Alfred Francis Russell, when James Briggs Payne made numerous agreements with the inner hinterland kingdoms and societies. Stop acting like we never worked together. Rachel Johnson was an Americo-Liberian who ended up marrying an African king. Rachel Johnson, another Rachel Johnson, not the one of Elijah Johnson, but another one, married an African king. You had Clarence Lorenzo Simpson, who had some family member who was an Americo-Liberian, married an indigenous woman. You have a situation which even Charles Taylor, one of the most brutal men in history, who destroyed Liberia, an Americo-Liberian father and a Gola mother. Stop acting like these were pure African Americans and we didn't mingle, we didn't do none of that. There were a lot, like you said, collaboration, conflict, intermarriages. You know, like how other African ethnic groups do, like the Yorubas, the Igbos, the Akans, the Hausa Fulanis, the Ijaz, the Amhara, the Oromos, the Tigres, the Maasai. Stop treating us like we are like Liberia is unique. It's unique in that it's a African diaspora, abolitionist, Pan-African state for sure, and we've talked about that. How Liberia is literally the culmination of Pan-Africanism and African American statism and Black nationalism. But stop treating the relationships between Africans and the diaspora as different from other ethnic groups in Africa. So that's my sense on it. I know I went 23 minutes on this, about 24 minutes, but I had to go in on this. I had to talk about this because this just proves what we have been saying for a long time now. And please share this video, get it out to everybody. Every African American, every Liberian, every African needs to see this video and needs to read that article. Like I said, you can get this from the Washington Post. You can get this from the GNN Liberia, Global News Network Liberia. But please share this video so that we can finally get rid of these conflicts once and for all. And of course, I will see you in the next video. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and sign up to the website. Peace, fam.